The Silver Creek Diner, a small but beloved roadside stop along Highway 89 in Arizona, was alive with the chatter of regulars and the comforting hum of country music drifting from the jukebox. The scent of grilled burgers and fresh coffee filled the air, wrapping the place in a warm, familiar embrace. Outside, parked like a midnight phantom against the dusty backdrop of the desert, sat the Rock's jet black SUV, sleek, imposing, and an unspoken testament to its owner's legendary presence. Inside, the Rock, clad in a fitted black t-shirt that barely contained his mountainous frame, sat alone in a corner booth. His massive hands gripped a fork and knife as he sliced into a thick, juicy steak, savoring the quiet, a rare moment of peace from his whirlwind life. He wasn't thinking about action movies or wrestling rings. Right now, it was just him, his meal, and maybe, if he was lucky, a slice of warm apple pie. Then, the air changed. A deep, thunderous growl rolled in from the distance, growing louder with each passing second. The Blood Vultures, a lawless biker gang known for chaos and destruction, had arrived. Their motorcycles tore into the parking lot, engines snarling like wild animals, drowning out the peaceful murmur of the diner. From his booth, the Rock didn't move. Not yet, but he heard them, felt the shift in energy. Outside, 6 men in tattered leather vests dismounted, their cruel smirks illuminated by the Arizona sun. And in that moment, peace was over. Outside Silver Creek Diner, the peace of the Arizona afternoon had been shattered. The Blood Vultures, a gang notorious for their reckless destruction, had descended like a pack of starving predators. Their black leather vests, covered in crude patches and faded skull emblems, flapped against the dry desert wind. The 6 men moved with the swagger of those who had never faced true consequences. Yet, their leader, Jackson Mad Dog Rains, a towering brute with a snake tattoo coiled around his neck, took a slow drag from his cigarette. His beady eyes locked onto the sleek black SUV parked by the diner's entrance, its glossy surface reflecting the unforgiving Arizona sun. He exhaled a cloud of smoke, his lips curling into a sneer. Well, well, he muttered, his voice dripping with mockery. Looks like some Hollywood hotshot thinks he can just roll up in our town like he owns the damn place. One of the gang members, a wiry man with a jagged scar down his cheek, let out a low whistle as he ran a gloved hand over the SUV's hood. Nice ride, he mused. Real shame if something happened to it. Jackson chuckled darkly before turning to his crew. Boys, he drawled, cracking his knuckles, I think we ought to leave a little welcome message. With that, chaos erupted. A chain snapped through the air, smashing against the windshield with a sickening crack. Another biker, a burly man covered in bad tattoos, pulled out a switchblade and drove it deep into the thick rubber of the tires. Air hissed violently as the SUV sank lower to the ground. Inside the diner, the mood shifted. Conversation stopped. The familiar clatter of forks and knives fell silent. Betty, the waitress, a tough woman who had seen her fair share of trouble, gripped the handle of a coffee pot like it was a weapon. Oh my God, she whispered, her eyes darting toward the booth in the corner. The Rock's hand froze midair, his fork still holding a perfect bite of steak. His jaw tensed ever so slightly, his knuckles whitening around the silverware. For a moment, he didn't move, didn't blink. He just listened. Betty swallowed hard. They're trashing your car, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Slowly, deliberately, the Rock set down his fork and knife. The leather of the booth groaned as he pushed back, his towering form unfolding with the ease of a man built for battle. The other patrons shrank into their seats, their breaths caught in their throats. Outside, the bikers laughed and jeered, emboldened by their destruction. Jackson took one final drag of his cigarette and flicked it onto the pavement. Let's see what kind of man drives a car like this, he sneered. The diner door swung open. The air seemed to tighten, as if the universe itself had paused to see what would happen next. The Rock stepped out. His shadow stretched across the pavement, swallowing the gang in its wake. Jackson's cocky smirk faltered, just a bit. And then, the Rock spoke. His voice was calm, measured, but filled with a weight that could crush mountains. You've got about 3 seconds to walk away before this turns into something you can't handle. What happens next? Does the gang back down? Or do they make the biggest mistake of their lives? Comment 1 if you think The Rock is about to destroy them. Hit like if you love stories of justice and retribution, and don't forget to subscribe to see what happens next. The world outside the Silver Creek Diner had gone eerily still. The dry desert wind whispered through the air, rustling the tumbleweeds along the roadside. Even the relentless Arizona sun seemed to pause, as if waiting for what was about to unfold. The Rock stood in the doorway, his massive frame casting a long shadow over the blood vultures. His expression remained unreadable, calm, controlled, but there was something in his stance, a barely contained force, like a storm teetering on the edge of eruption. Jackson Mad Dog Reigns took a lazy step forward, feigning amusement. Well, well, look who it is, he drawled, arms spread wide as if greeting an old friend. Dwayne freakin' Johnson. Man, I gotta say, love your movies. His lips curled into a smirk. But this ain't Hollywood, big guy. Out here, things work a little different. The gang chuckled behind him, emboldened by their numbers, their boots scraping against the pavement as they fanned out in a loose semicircle. One of them, a thick-necked brute with a busted nose, kicked the side of the Rock's SUV for good measure. The metallic clang echoed across the lot. The Rock's gaze flicked toward the damage. A muscle in his jaw twitched. He took a slow step forward. Last chance, he said, his voice steady, lethal in its restraint. Walk away. The bikers exchanged glances before laughter erupted. Oh, you hear that, boys? Jackson taunted, rolling his shoulders. He thinks he's the one calling the shots. He stepped closer, tilting his head, trying to get a read on the man in front of him. See, the thing is, we don't walk away from nothing. You, on the other hand, he flicked a glance at the SUV. Might want to rethink your travel plans. Silence. Then, in a flash faster than any of them could register, the Rock moved. Before Jackson even knew what hit him, a wrecking ball-sized fist collided with his gut. The breath rushed out of his lungs, his body folding like a ragdoll as he stumbled backward. His boots scraped against the pavement, his hands grasping at empty air, but the Rock wasn't done. With surgical precision, the Rock grabbed the front of Jackson's leather vest and lifted, not just pushed, lifted, the man off his feet like he weighed nothing. With a sharp pivot, he slammed him against the side of the SUV. The force of impact sent a spiderweb of cracks through the remaining glass of the windshield. The other bikers hesitated, their bravado wavering. Jackson groaned, spitting dust and saliva as he tried to gather himself. Big mistake, he hissed, reaching for the brass knuckles in his back pocket. The Rock saw it coming before he even moved. With a brutal efficiency honed through years of discipline, he twisted Jackson's wrist, sending the weapon clattering to the ground. In the same motion, his knee came up, fast, devastating, colliding with Jackson's ribs. A sickening crack followed. Jackson collapsed onto his knees, gasping for air, his fingers clutching at his side. The gang exploded into motion. One of them lunged with a rusty chain, swinging it wide, aiming for the Rock's head. But the Rock ducked, snatching the chain midair with one massive hand and yanking. The biker had no time to react before he was ripped forward, meeting the Rock's elbow, full force, to his face. Another thug, a wiry man with wild eyes, charged with a switchblade. The Rock sidestepped, caught his wrist, and twisted. The blade tumbled to the ground with a dull clatter. Before the man could react, the Rock sent a punch so precise, so devastating, that the biker spun on his heels before crumpling to the ground unconscious. The last three bikers hesitated. Their arrogance had evaporated, replaced by something else, fear. The Rock straightened, rolling his shoulders. Who's next? They ran. The air in Silver Creek Diner's parking lot was thick with tension. The blood vultures, once confident in their numbers, were now shaken. The scene before them was unlike anything they had ever encountered. Their leader, Jackson Mad Dog Reigns, was struggling to breathe on the pavement, clutching his ribs as if they might crumble beneath him. Two of their toughest men lay sprawled out, unconscious. The others stood frozen, their once cocky grins now wiped clean, replaced by something much colder. Fear. The Rock stood unmoved. His expression hadn't changed. He wasn't breathing heavy. He wasn't sweating. He was simply there, an immovable force, a storm-given form, a man who had warned them and was ready to finish what they had started. A biker with a shaved head, his knuckles wrapped in taped fists, clenched his jaw and took a cautious step forward. He wanted to prove something, to his gang, to himself. You ain't so tough, he muttered under his breath, his voice barely convincing. The Rock's gaze locked onto him, piercing through the false bravado. Try me, he said, his voice as steady as ever. The biker lunged. But the Rock was faster. He caught the man's wrist midair, and with a single effortless twist, he flipped him onto the asphalt. The thug hit the ground hard, the air knocked clean from his lungs. He wheezed, rolling onto his side, groaning in pain. That was the breaking point. The last two standing bikers bolted. They didn't even try to fight. They turned on their heels and ran, their boots slamming against the pavement as they sprinted for their bikes. One of them fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking as he tried to get the engine to turn over. The Rock shook his head. Pathetic. Jackson, still on his knees, spat blood onto the pavement. Despite the agony racking his body, the humiliation of being beaten so easily burned deeper. He forced himself to look up at the Rock, his eyes filled with pure hatred. "This ain't over," he rasped. His breath labored, his hand still clutching his side. The Rock took a slow step forward, towering over him. "Yeah," he said, voice low, almost disappointed. "It is." And then, with one final act of dominance, the Rock reached down and grabbed Jackson by the collar of his torn leather vest. He hauled the man up with zero effort and shoved him backward, hard. Jackson stumbled, barely catching himself before crashing into the side of his own bike. His hands trembled as he gripped the handlebars for support. For the first time in his life, Jackson felt small. The Rock's gaze never wavered. "Next time," he said, voice like distant thunder, "you walk away when I tell you to." The wind howled through the empty parking lot. The diner patrons, still frozen inside, watched in stunned silence. And then, as if the world itself knew the fight had ended, the distant sound of sirens split through the air. The low wail of sirens echoed in the distance, but the blood vultures weren't finished. Not yet. Jackson Mad Dog Reigns wiped the blood from his split lip and forced himself to stand, his ribs aching from the brutal beating the Rock had just delivered. His pride, however, was in worse condition than his body. His gang, what was left of it, was either knocked out, groaning on the pavement, or scrambling onto their bikes to flee. But Jackson wasn't about to let this go, not in front of his men, not in front of the people in the diner who had watched him get humiliated. With a sudden, reckless growl, he lunged forward. His right hand whipped toward his boot, snatching a gleaming switchblade from its sheath. His movements were quick, but the Rock was quicker. Before Jackson's blade could even get close, the Rock exploded into action. His massive hand snatched Jackson's wrist mid-strike, gripping it like an iron vise. Jackson's entire arm locked up, pain shooting through his tendons as the Rock twisted it effortlessly. The knife clattered to the pavement. But the Rock wasn't done. With a single powerful motion, he yanked Jackson off his feet and hurled him backward. Jackson slammed into the hood of a parked motorcycle, his back arching from the impact, before crumpling to the ground with a pained groan. The remaining bikers, already half out the door, froze in place. One of them, a thick-set man covered in faded tattoos, glanced at the others. He knew the rules of the road. If the leader went down, the gang either stood or crumbled. And right now, the blood vultures were crumbling fast. But the Rock had no interest in letting any of them get away unscathed. The moment the tattooed biker hesitated, the Rock was on him. He reached out and snatched the man by the front of his vest, hoisting him up like a rag doll. The biker barely had time to grunt in surprise before the Rock drove a knee straight into his gut, sending him gasping to the asphalt. Another thug, seeing his only option was to fight or run, chose to fight. He swung a heavy chain, aiming to catch the Rock across the face. Bad move. The Rock ducked beneath the whistling arc, his reflexes impossibly fast for a man of his size. As the biker tried to recover from the missed strike, the Rock stepped in close and delivered a devastating right hook to the man's jaw. The impact sent the thug spinning before he collapsed, out cold, onto the pavement. The last remaining biker, shaking so badly he could barely mount his motorcycle, finally got the engine to roar to life. He revved it once, twice, but before he could take off, a massive hand clamped onto the back of his jacket. The Rock ripped him off the bike with terrifying ease, tossing him onto the ground like discarded trash. The biker groaned in pain, scrambling backward, eyes wide with terror. And just like that, it was over. Jackson lay motionless, his body heaving from exhaustion. His gang, broken, battered, and unconscious, were sprawled around the parking lot, defeated beyond recognition. The Rock rolled his shoulders and exhaled slowly, his composure returning as he surveyed the carnage around him. He looked down at Jackson one last time. "You should have walked away." And then, flashing red and blue lights filled the lot. The law had arrived. The flashing police lights painted the Silver Creek Diner in streaks of red and blue as the officers worked to clean up the mess. The blood vultures, once feared on the open road, now lay in shackles, their swagger and bravado replaced by groans of pain and seething humiliation. Jackson Mad Dog Reigns, barely able to stand on his own, was dragged toward a squad car, his wrists bound behind his back. Sheriff Daniels watched from the sidelines, his hands resting on his belt, shaking his head in disbelief. He'd dealt with bikers before, petty crimes, bar fights, the occasional armed robbery. But this, a whole gang, dismantled by one man? That wasn't just rare, that was damn near impossible. The Rock, standing amidst the wreckage, was the only one who looked unfazed. He had handled the blood vultures like a force of nature, and now, as the gang members were stuffed into police cruisers, he simply stood there, calm, composed, and very much in control. Daniels exhaled and stepped up beside him. "You sure know how to make a mess, Johnson." The Rock smirked but said nothing. The sheriff turned his gaze toward Jackson, who was slumped against the side of the squad car, his busted lip curled into a sneer. Even through the pain, the biker's eyes burned with defiance. "You think you've won?" Jackson spat, blood staining his teeth. "You think this is over?" Daniels rolled his eyes. "Oh, for crying out loud, Rains. You can barely stand." Jackson chuckled darkly, shifting his weight against the car. "You don't get it, Sheriff. The blood vultures don't just ride alone. We've got brothers all over. You think this ends tonight? You think he walks away clean?" His gaze locked onto the Rock, filled with a promise of vengeance. Daniels sighed, rubbing his temple. Yeah, heard it all before. This ain't over. You'll pay for this. Blah, blah, blah." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a cold whisper. "Hate to break it to you, but you don't look like a man with many options right now." Jackson glared but said nothing. Daniels straightened, giving his deputies the nod. "Get him out of here." The back door of the police cruiser slammed shut, locking Jackson inside. The remaining officers continued rounding up the gang, reading them their rights as they were loaded into separate vehicles. Daniels turned back to the Rock. "So, what now? You need a lift into town?" The Rock cast a glance at his battered SUV. The once pristine machine was now a wreck. Windshield shattered, doors dented, tires slashed. It would take a miracle to get it back on the road anytime soon. He exhaled sharply. "Yeah, guess I do." Daniels chuckled and motioned toward his own patrol car. "Come on, I'll take you back to town. Least I can do for the guy who just saved me months of headache." As the Rock moved toward the vehicle, the last of the bikers were hauled away, their engines roaring as the police convoy began to pull out of the lot. But before the last cruiser disappeared down the highway, Jackson's voice cut through the night like a blade. "You better watch your back, Johnson." The Rock didn't flinch. He didn't even turn around. He simply got into the passenger seat of the sheriff's car and shut the door. As the police vehicles disappeared into the darkness, a heavy silence settled over the diner. The crowd that had gathered outside slowly filtered back inside, whispering among themselves about what they had just witnessed. Betty, the diner's longtime waitress, stood near the entrance, arms crossed over her chest. She watched the Rock climb into the patrol car and shook her head with a smirk. "Damn fool bikers," she muttered. "They really thought they had a chance." The sheriff's car pulled out of the lot, kicking up a cloud of dust as it sped down the highway. Back inside the diner, the hum of conversation returned. The jukebox crackled back to life. The world kept turning. But out there, somewhere on the open road, the blood vultures weren't finished yet. Sheriff Daniels' patrol car rumbled down the dark highway, cutting through the stillness of the Arizona night. The Rock sat in the passenger seat, arms crossed over his broad chest, his gaze fixed on the endless stretch of road ahead. His expression was unreadable, but beneath the calm exterior, he knew this wasn't over. Jackson Mad Dog Rains had made a promise, one that men like him don't break. Daniels, keeping one hand on the wheel, glanced sideways. "You sure stirred up a hornet's nest tonight, Johnson." The Rock didn't blink. "They started it." Daniels let out a low chuckle. "Yeah, well, they don't strike me as the forgive and forget type." He exhaled, shaking his head. "Blood vultures got connections. If Jackson gets a message out, it won't be long before his boys come looking for payback." The Rock didn't respond. He didn't need to. Daniels sighed. "Look, I can get you set up in town for the night. Make some calls, have some eyes on you until you can figure out your next move." The Rock finally turned, his expression calm but firm. "I'll be fine." Daniels scoffed. "Yeah, no doubt. But that doesn't mean trouble won't find you." Before the Rock could answer, the radio crackled to life. "Sheriff, we got a situation." The urgency in the deputy's voice sent a chill through the air. Daniels grabbed the radio. "Go ahead." "It's the convoy, sir. One of the patrol cars just got hit. It's bad. Looks like an ambush." Daniels stiffened. "Where?" "Highway 60, just past the canyon road. We need backup now." Silence. The Rock turned his head slightly, his sharp eyes locking onto the sheriff. Daniels clenched his jaw. "Damn it!" He swerved the car around, tires screeching as he floored the gas. The engine roared as they tore through the empty stretch of highway, heading straight toward the fight. The Rock's fists slowly clenched. He knew what this meant. Jackson hadn't been bluffing. Somewhere up ahead in the darkness of the desert, the blood vultures were waiting. And this time, they weren't coming for his car. They were coming for him. What happens next? Will the Rock survive the ambush? Will Jackson's reinforcements be stronger than before? Comment 1 if you think the Rock is about to teach them another lesson. Smash like if you love seeing justice served the hard way. And don't forget to subscribe, because this battle is far from over.